well aware of the irony of me giving a talk on hedging today, because despite spending nearly all day, every day, researching and reading about gendered and intentional language, I still consistently use phrases like I think, maybe, and sort of in nearly every conversation I have. And I've always thought that was just me, my personality, my communication style, until one winter day in 2019, when I met up with two colleagues, Lynn and Emily, for a brew to talk about software design decisions. Because for the first few months of my PhD, I'd been reading about design and gender and really struggling to fill in the gaps. But they mentioned this thing called hedging, and suddenly everything clicked. For so long, I'd been reading books, interviewing authors, writing music, and playing with words to try and make sense of them. But this one conversation led me to realize that perhaps all of my frustrations and interests were actually linked. And picking apart how language is used and how conversations take place became my way of making sense of a world I felt so alien in. So, what actually is hedging? Hedging is short for hedging your bets in language, and it includes using phrases like I think, maybe, and sort of. And it was first introduced by linguists in the 70s, but what's wild to me is not many of us have heard of it since. But despite this, hedging is something most of us know that we do. We add a just in our emails, we downplay our expertise, and in my case, we send 1,000 exclamation points with every message we ever send. So hedging is something most of us know that we do, but understanding why we do it and its impact is key to making it work for us. Because more modern research suggests that hedging is actually a political tool, and one that allows us to enact agency. But as researchers, it's really hard for us to figure out why people are using hedging without interrupting them as soon as they speak, saying, well, why did you say that? What did you mean by that? What were you hoping would happen there? And here's where it gets really interesting. There's a gender dimension to all of this too. Research tells us that women use hedging far more frequently than men, and the same was actually found to be true in TED Talks themselves. But this disproportionate hedging directly correlates with how women are perceived in leadership roles. This linguistic self-sabotage stems from really valid concerns. Women who speak more directly are more likely to face negative performance feedback compared to men using identical language. And this creates what we call the double bind. Assertiveness without mitigation risks social penalties, and yet excessive softening undermines our authority and credibility. I saw a tweet once, which genuinely made me laugh out loud, which did get me some funny looks on the bus, and it said, "My goal is to start being more assertive if it's okay with you guys." And it just perfectly captures the double bind. But hedging isn't actually always a bad thing. In fact, it can be a really powerful tool when it's used intentionally. One of my favorite examples of this is something I've coined the button example, because I work in software development. So imagine you're in a design meeting. Instead of saying, I think the button should go on the left, try saying, as you know, the button should go on the left. With those two words, you know, you're hedging your bets, but not in the way you're used to. You're hedging your bets that they do in fact know that, or that social order dictates they won't correct you. It's an entirely different approach to, I think the button should go on the left. You know I have experience in this area. You know last time we went out at 11 p.m. we missed the brunch booking. You know how meal times are a capitalist scam. Those 3 projects, you know I finished them. Do you see how powerful that is? You know. But my favorite technique to unpick the impact of hedging is a singular word, why. I call this the power of why, and I've been using it my whole life without realizing, ironically, why. As an autistic person, I have used why to unpick uncertainty at nearly every possible juncture of conversation I've ever had. But let's take it back to the button example and see what it looks like in practice. You're back in a design meeting, and person A says, I think the button should go on the left. And person B disagrees, and they say the button should go on the right. Now, historically, we may have been more likely to listen to person B because they said their answer with more confidence. But not anymore, because we're going to use that simple but effective question, why? Now, both parties are given the opportunity to explain their reasons, which might range from anything from, well, I read the user research report, which accounts for 98% of users looking for the button on the left, all the way through to, But what this does is it allows us to figure out people's reasons when they speak. It allows us to figure out who is downplaying their expertise and who is framing their opinion as a fact. I have a core memory of being in year 6, where my need to understand why led to a notable falling out with my teacher about whether or not 1 is considered a prime number. And that's still a hill I'm willing to die on if anyone wants to correct me. But my persistent questioning why wasn't me wasn't me trying to be difficult or awkward. I was genuinely trying to reconcile this mathematical concept with my understanding. I couldn't accept just a statement of fact. I needed to know the reasons why. My questioning was so intense that a couple of months ago when I bumped into my Year 6 teacher, he confessed to me that later that day he had to go and find out why, so that he could tell me that. The neurotypical world often perceives my direct questioning as rudeness. But now I know how my brain works, I do two things, and I suggest everyone does these two. The first thing is when I start working with a new team, I let them know how I need information and tasks. And I got this tip from previous TEDx speaker Ellie Middleton. And she lets people know that she needs information on a what, by when, and why basis. And the why is really key for me because it helps me stay motivated. The second point is giving my why, my reasons, stops me from being misunderstood in so many different areas of my life. So you might be sat there thinking, well, should I just eliminate all hedging from my language? And my answer to that is no. As I mentioned before, the blanket removal of hedging doesn't necessarily improve outcomes for us. It just means we're more likely to be labelled as difficult or awkward. And while we try and dismantle the structures which give us those labels, how do we navigate that as individuals? This creates what some researchers, myself included, call the damned if I do, damned if I don't predicament. No, it's the double bind I mentioned earlier. So what's needed instead is intentional language based on context. The ability to deploy or withhold hedging based on the context, our audience, and our goals. It's about being more intentional in the way that we all speak. It's about turning hedging from an unconscious habit into a conscious choice. And it's about reframing hedging, not as a weakness to be overcome, but as a skill to be refined. And that allows us to maintain our authentic voices whilst navigating spaces which were not designed with everybody in mind. So with that, I'd like to leave you with three things. First, when you're tired of making decisions, instead of hedging, try clearly articulating your preference, which in this case would be, my preference is to not make a decision today. I use it all the time, probably so much so my husband's sick of hearing it. Second, when you find yourself overusing I think, try strategically claiming the knowledge that you have. Save the I think for when it's going to serve your purpose. I know, or as you know, the research shows. And three, when somebody boldly declares something you disagree with, for example, we don't have a racism problem, a real example a client shared with me recently, ask them why. I'd be interested to know why you've said that when all the research says opposite. Hedging is a tool that simultaneously reflects humility and uncertainty whilst also allowing for influence and persuasion. Learning how to hedge intentionally is a journey. It's a little bit like when you decide the model of car you want to buy and then you see it everywhere on the roads. Is that just me? That was hedging. Once you know what hedging is, you will see it everywhere. But learning how to hedge intentionally is a journey worth going on, because when you master the art of intentional hedging, you don't just change how others perceive you, you change how you perceive yourself.